we can go and walk you through what we have so far. And please, anybody, don't wait till the end. Stop us if you have questions and that. Mikey, do you have the slides? Or Janice, do you have them?
I believe Mike is sharing the slides right now. Yep.
Can everyone see the slides?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Let me know when you want me to forward, Jack.
Go right ahead. You can forward it. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you. So just to remind everybody, sort of where this started from, the goals of the study have been to put in place a process for documenting traffic stops, and that is in place in all of the agencies in Douglas County. We'll talk to you a little bit about that. To look at the data and determine if there's any disparities, where this group had asked the question originally, and to see if we can determine if there are, and if there are any disparities out there that we do identify, and work with the agency to solve those disparities, to either understand them, that they're legitimate, or deal with them if they have concerns. So that's sort of been the overall goal of the study from when we started. You can go ahead and up it one more. Where we are is you all have been involved. A lot of you have been involved in the planning for it and all the work to put it in place. And there's some people from the agencies, chiefs and Trent and everybody who's been so helpful in getting it in place. But we're sort of in the data collection phase now and starting to accumulate enough data to start some of the analyses. And you'll see some of that today. And if you might want to move it up one more slide, Janice, you can take over and talk about the planning or where we are with this.
Sure. So into the next slide, you'll see we've sort of provided a summary of what we have done regarding the planning. One of the first things we did, as we noted, was sort of develop a stop data collection form. We met with all 5 law enforcement agencies and the sub-CJCC committee to identify what were some of the key elements that should be included in the stop data collection form. While we could have potentially brought in forms that are used across the country, it became essential to us and necessary to make sure that we were collecting the right information based on the needs and sort of the within the circumstances of each of the law enforcement agencies, depending on what types of variables they're already collecting, to make sure we're able to match them across the county, but also provide each agency with their own individual information that they might see necessary. We revised it after we heard feedback and sort of finalized the stop data collection form, as you see here. We provided all law enforcement agencies with a copy, as well as the sub-CJCC committee. By August, we started our training, and in going through the training, we started to develop sort of a set of guidelines for collecting information based on some of the circumstances, some of the cases that we heard about. We completed several different training sessions, I will say, with several of the senior command staff, and in some of the agencies like Baldwin and Eudora with the officers in all of the 5 law enforcement agencies. We asked the agencies to begin data collection on September 1st. Given certain logistics, some agencies began collecting the information a few days after, some a few days before. So for the most part, the data was generally collected by September of 2019. Now, as soon as we started getting a month's worth of data, we started auditing the information just to make sure that all agencies were collecting the information in a consistent manner, and just sort of to start getting feedback to every agency. So we checked for accuracy at the end of each month. We asked all agencies to provide us with, to upload the information and send it over to us. So we began sending out these monthly memos that sort of describes and summarizes the information they've sent us. It identified any missing, unknown information. There were some discrepancies. We responded to them immediately after. All agencies verify the patterns and trends that we presented them with to make sure we were sort of on track from what they've seen or what they've heard from their officers. And of course, we started receiving some feedback, responding to some questions/comments. This was a great process, I have to say. Throughout the entire process, law enforcement agencies responded to us immediately. Their IT folk were great about uploading the information and sending it to us. So we were able to provide them with these updates in a pretty systematic manner. And you can move to the next slide, Mike. Thank you. So as we mentioned, we sort of finalized the data collection process, provided them with about 4 months worth of information around January, just to review sort of the data collection process, piloting those first 4 months worth of data. We continue to do the same thing. We plan on doing this up until July, sort of reviewing the information, sending them information each month, and then of course, collectively all the data that we have. So just as a summary, so that everybody knows, we have information right now from September of 2019 to about April of 2020, the end of April of 2020, give or take a few extra days in May for some of the agencies. There are a total of 9,784 pedestrian and traffic stops that were conducted and for which we have information. The data for those stops that were conducted from September to April, knowing that those first couple of weeks for the analysis stage, we will be sort of taking out just because we are piloting the data collection. But just for the purposes of presenting you with the information that we have so far, we've included it in this presentation. Just to provide you with an overview of some of the patterns and trends. And of course, given recent events, we thought it important to sort of highlight sort of the impact that the pandemic has had on the number of stops that were conducted and some similar patterns we've seen in other parts of the country. And we can move to the next slide. Thanks, Mike. So some of the patterns we've mentioned, and this is something we presented last year with regard to sort of what we would start doing, is one of the first things we start examining are some of the seasonal effects, what we call patterns over time. The seasonal effects that happen just as we found them, stops tend to go up during the summer months, they tend to drop during the winter months. Some of the daytime and nighttime effects, one of the things that we found in a lot of the literature is sort of noting that, police officers obviously have a better view during the daytime, less of a view of the individual during the nighttime. And so we make sure we explore those stops, separating that daytime and nighttime effect. Any major events we've said before, originally, of course, back in the day, we were thinking of KU basketball games. We were assuming that would have a significant impact, not knowing back then that COVID-19 would take place and that would dramatically change everyone's lifestyle. So we've included an analysis that carefully looks at the day-to-day changes right before, during, and of course, hopefully we get to the point where we're examining it after the COVID-19 impact, and of course, policy changes that came as a result. So just to provide you an overview, the next slide will sort of talk you through a little bit of the seasonal effects. Thanks, Mike. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So from September through the end of April, generally speaking, as we noted, the number of stops tend to increase, and particularly given sort of the context, the fact that college classes began taking place, tend to be higher during the summer, fall months, and then they tend to drop during the winter and go back up in the spring. Now, the trend that we've seen, and the trend that a lot of other law enforcement agencies have started to see is a dramatic drop, right? Right around March, as you might imagine, when a lot of different jurisdictions started putting stay-at-home policies in place. And so in September of 2019, there were a total of 1,634 traffic stops and about 315 pedestrian stops. And both pedestrian stops and traffic stops started noticing a decrease in that time period. There was a slight increase from November to December, and then a drop from December to January, and a continued decrease thereafter, with the number of stops by March of 2020 nearly being half of that which we might expect it to be. And we can move to the next slide.
And as Janice was saying, this is not something that's happening just in Douglas County. It's been happening all across the country. They've had some pretty well-documented cases where, for a variety of reasons, sometimes some agencies have told their officers there are fewer cars on the road, you know, you're going to have less traffic enforcement. Other agencies have told their officers to be cautious when they're interacting with the public, when they don't know if they might be infected. And so to do things that discretionary activities should be couched around that. So there's a lot of different things going on, but all across the country, the traffic enforcement stops and pedestrian enforcement stops have dropped dramatically. I don't know if any of the police on the line wanted to comment on that. You can go ahead, Jan.
Yep, and we can move to the next slide, Mike. Thanks. So the next figure we'll start looking at is we basically explore the data based on daytime and nighttime. And I will say this is sort of in aggregate terms because we didn't quite, there is actually a calendar for daytime and nighttime effects month to month in Douglas County that we can use and control for that. But for right now, just for the purposes of this presentation, we decided to sort of use 7 p.m. as the general cutoff, knowing that in winter months, obviously it's a little bit earlier, summer months it's a little bit later. But of course, just for this purpose, as you can see here, there is a dramatic increase in the number of stops that take place right around the nighttime, right around that peak hour. And this is very consistent with other jurisdictions. This trend will obviously vary agency to agency, knowing that there are a larger downtown sort of lively areas where people are more likely to be out in certain places. And so therefore we just sort of match this to try to give you sort of an examination of what it is like when stops take place in the morning versus those that take place during the nighttime. For many of you that drive during those nighttime in those particular areas, I'm sure you will notice the same thing. Yeah. And we can move to the next slide.
I think you've got it there already, Janice.
We're off by the slide somehow.
Yeah, Mike, if you could go back one, that would be great. Perfect. Go ahead, Janice.
All right, I think there's a delay in my end, but so we generally would not do this, but based on the event, this is sort of something we just wanted to show to you. We explore the data on a day-to-day basis for the number of stops that took place from March 1st through the end of April, which is the data we have up until now. And I know for Douglas County, the stay-at-home order, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but this is based on my understanding, was put into place on March 24th of 2020. And so we start to notice a dramatic drop after about the 13th of March in terms of the number of stops that were taking place. And I know, having spoken to a few agencies, that there was a shift in the policy. And this is something that we plan on controlling for, because this is a very unique event, but it's an event nonetheless that we can match to a number of other events that happened in the past in other jurisdictions. So as we've noted to some agencies, this is something we're going to control for, absolutely, because this is unique. This is something that's not going to have an impact in Kansas alone. It's going to have an impact in other states, and other areas are going to be tracking this as well. So we're hoping to sort of match this to what's been going on around the country as well, in terms of the dramatic change and how significant it is. We're going to continue to view this through obviously the end of the year and sort of checking to see if there are any policy changes. And I will say, for those local agencies, we will absolutely continue having this conversation about when they change in terms of practices or any informal or formal policies that you have in place, to make sure that we track the decrease in line with those policies that are in place.
And the one other impact that everyone should be aware of is, we had estimated that a year's worth of data would give us a sufficient number of stops of, individual groups, African Americans, Asians, Latinos, and that was an estimate figuring it would be the same amount, on average, the similar kinds of stops. So not knowing how long this is going to last, it may impact how quickly we'll have enough cases to be able to do all the analyses we want to do.
So you'll be extending phase 2? Is that what you're thinking?
Maybe. I mean, we may have enough. It's, you know, this may not go for till September, but if it does, then, you know, we may be just keeping the data collection going.
Okay.
And we can move to the next slide. So one of the things we will start looking at, and this is actually a discussion we've had with our research team a few days back, is sort of to start identifying some of the spatial patterns. You know, just like crime, we realize that things take place in certain areas, certain particular intersections where police officers are more likely to patrol, more likely to issue a ticket just because of congestion, just because of certain events. So we will start breaking down, if at all possible, as much as we can. And this is going to vary by jurisdiction. We will examine the census tract, the zip code, the neighborhoods, and each individual city in order to determine and sort of map out where most of these stops are taking place at what point in time, just so that we can make sure to control for those particular things. I know one of the agencies, we noticed a pattern of something that was taking place in one particular area, and to make sure if there was a special detail that was in place to sort of understand better why the stops increase in that particular area. So we will be tracking stops across the place as well as over time.
You can go to the next slide, Mike. And so for the analysis, you know, as we've talked about before, we're going to do two different kinds of, well, multiple kinds of analyses, but one is internal, where we look at it, all the officers involved from a given agency, and are there any outliers there in terms of racial disparities, in terms of regular traffic enforcement. And we'll look at that in terms of stops, searches, search outcomes, citations, to sort of see if there are officers. And as we've said all along, you've heard us say it, is that some of that's completely legitimate. There's people that are officers that are assigned with traffic enforcement, and they're going to do more stops. And there are officers assigned with certain kinds of activity that may do certain stops or more searches. So we'll be looking at that and working with the agencies to identify that. You can go to the next slide, Mike. This is a slide that talks about, of all the stops, that 9,700 stops that Janice mentioned, this is the reason for the stop. And there's some interesting things going on here. If you see, the other traffic violation groups a bunch of different ones together, but the next highest one is speeding. And speeding 10 miles per hour or more is the most common reason people get stopped, followed by equipment violations. You would think that's pretty common around the country. That's, you know, and you could see that the speeding less than 10 miles an hour, which is down the fourth from the bottom, is only 2% of the stops. So it really is that people who are going really fast are the ones getting stopped, and people who have equipment violations. A couple of other things. One of the things that we talked about a lot in training and talked to the officers about, and we've talked to you folks about, is calls for service. You know, do people call when someone's in their neighborhood that looks suspicious, and the police come and make a traffic stop as result of that call? And, you know, it is the case that happens, but it's 3% of the calls. And so it's not happening all that often that people are calling and saying this person's acting suspiciously in our neighborhood, and we, you know, would like the police to come and look at them. And way down the bottom, that APB BOLO, which is all points bulletin or be on the lookout, is something that in some of the literature people say, you know, that causes some racial disparities in stops, because you'll get, you know, somebody call in and say, somebody just robbed my house, and they are Asian or Latino or whatever, and then the police come and see someone who matches that description. But that happens very, very rarely in your communities. It's less than 1% of the stops come as a result of you know, all points bulletin or a be on the lookout for. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the kind of stops that are out there. Let me, I think most people are muted, but if you want to raise your hand, if you have a question, we can certainly respond to it now or at the end of the call, whichever end of the presentation, whichever you prefer.
I have a question. Jack, can you repeat what you just said about APB and BOLO versus suspicious person? Because when you were explaining them, they sounded kind of like the same thing, not what I was thinking that meant.
Oh, okay, sure, absolutely. Suspicious person would be a call from a citizen or a community member. It'd be 911 call. There's a suspicious person on my street or in my store or something. Come and take a look at this, help me out. Whereas all points bulletin or a BOLO is issued by the police department. This place has just been robbed, and here's a description of the people that robbed it. It's 2 women with, this kind of KU garb on, and then telling the police to go ahead and be on the lookout for that. So it really talks about the origin of the call.
Okay, that's what I thought it meant, but when you were explaining it, I thought I heard something different. Okay, thank you.
Sure. Mike, do you want to switch to the next slide? Or if anybody else has questions, please.
How large is that other traffic violation category? I mean, how many things fit inside that since it's such a big group?
It is a big group, and we've been working with the agencies to try to get that, to understand that. We have some other ways to sort of try to break that out. So we're going to try to get that down in numbers. It is a little bit of an unusual situation to have that many others. We also have looked at it over time, and there was more in the beginning when people weren't as clear about what they should be doing with the data collection, and less in the more recent time. So that's going to get better too over time. It's a great question though. Mike, you want to move to the next one when you have time? All right, this is what happens in the stops in your county.
You muted Jack. There we go.
Yep. Okay, back. Thanks. So this is telling you what happened in the stops in Douglas County, and we've talked to some of the agencies about this. As you can see, 3.2% of the stops result in the arrest of a driver or a passenger. 1.2% are arrest based on a warrant. 22% of the stops get a citation. And then I can't see it quite here. Janice, you might have it in front of you, but I think it's 66% of the stops get a warning.
Yeah.
In Kansas, you guys are really nice. That doesn't happen everywhere. I worked at one agency where 98% of the stops got a citation. I mean, this is true across all your agencies. Whenever we look at, a warning is the modal and most common response to a traffic stop, which is nice. But you could see the sort of breakout about what happens in the traffic stops going, across all the agencies. Of course, we're going to break this out by individual police departments and then break it out by race and ethnicity to sort of see if there are disparities across this. But it shows you that, if you get stopped in Douglas County, you're more likely to get a warning than a citation, by far. Mike, you want to go to the next one? So where this analysis will go now that as soon as we start to get enough stops of non-whites, is to look at it, the internal benchmarks I just mentioned, and then this one, which will look at external. So the traffic stops will be against an estimate of the population. And what that means is that we'd add into Douglas County, or to each jurisdiction, some of the KU student numbers for the demographics of their students and around the surrounding counties. We also are going to look at traffic crash data, because that's being collected at least in some of the communities, and is it a comparison to that? So we're going to look at and then as Janice said, the daytime, nighttime thing, that's become another way people have looked at this. In other words, saying that at night, a police officer is less likely to be able to know the race of the person that they're pulling over than in the day. And so if the day and the night look the same, then, that tells you that there's no differences there. if there's more people of color being pulled over during the day, it might be a cause for concern, because that's sort of the way that rationale goes. And Mike, if you want to move it up one more. And we'll continue to meet with the folks who are involved, to meet with you folks, give you as much updates as frequently as you'd like, with working with the police departments to give them the data back, and, you know, make an annual report that, you know, you folks to you folks and each of the agencies to sort of say, here's what we're seeing in terms of disparities and any other kinds of changes in traffic patterns. And as Janice said, you know, the biggest one we're facing right now is that very few traffic stops are being done. And that's going to change. It's obviously changing, you know, how we're going to be able to look at the data. This period is going to be unusual.
Yeah, and this will be an area that we're hoping to get feedback from everybody, you know, particularly as things continue to progress or things continue to change over time. In terms of local policies and practices that we're starting to see. And as you might imagine, we look at the data and then we sort of dig in deep to determine what exactly is going on and try to understand why certain things happen and why there's a dramatic decrease versus an increase at certain times in certain places. So this is something that is a continuing conversation we're having with both law enforcement agencies, the sub-CJCC committee, and Mike.
Questions, thoughts?
Tamara has a question.
Yes, this is Tamara. I was just wanting to make sure that I heard correctly. Did you say that there is not currently a ethnic breakdown on the people who are given warnings?
We have that. We just don't have many cases. So as soon as we get more data, we'll be able to present that. But you can't present it with like 10 cases of stops in Baldwin County, let's say Baldwin City, for you know, for it just wouldn't be reliable. So we're trying to get enough cases to be able to share that with you.
Okay, well, that certainly is important.
Absolutely. No, and it'll definitely be part of the analysis, both at the individual agency level and then at the county level. But that's one of the things we'll be looking at. Just right now, the numbers are so small that, you know, we're talking about, you know, maybe 100 stops of Asians in Lawrence, for example. And when you do that over time, it starts to get really, it's just small ends. But we'll have more.
Thank you.
Hey, Chuck, has a question? Did you have your hand up?
I just like to say, Jack and Janice, it's really good to see you. I'm glad you're doing well, and I appreciate the update. And yeah, you guys do seem to be in more of a high-risk area, so please take care, and we'll look forward to seeing you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, and please feel free to contact us at any point. We are going through the data, and the primary purpose is to examine very close to race and ethnic background, while keeping in mind we're controlling for a variety of different factors. For our purposes, it's better to have complete data and present that rather than partial data and have a misinterpretation of it. So we're making sure we sort of go through with a fine needle. And if for anybody that has any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to us.
We're happy to make specific runs for anybody here, any of the council members, to be able to, you know, try to dig deeper, as Janice said, to some of these questions for you.
Chuck, did you have a question?
Did, but I think I'll just send them an email. I think it may be
Okay.
easier to go that way. Thank you. Thanks to both of you for that presentation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.